Well, here we are in the Concorde hangar at Heathrow. Behind me, aircraft Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Delta, the fourth of the British Airways Concordes. And very shortly, this aeroplane will be pushed back and will be towed to the gate at Terminal 4, ready for a very special journey. This is not simply a scheduled flight to New York or even Barbados. This aeroplane is ready for its trip around the world.
Since 1976, Concorde has flown from London and Paris to New York's John F. Kennedy Airport up to 3 times a day, plying the Atlantic Ocean in just over 3 hours at twice the speed of sound. But rarely has this evocative aircraft ventured beyond these shores. In 1999, however, history was made and speed records broken as Concorde undertook the ultimate trip, a full circumnavigation of the globe. In October 1999, 80 specially invited wealthy American travellers boarded this BA Concorde for what was to become a 22-day, never-to-be-repeated, record-breaking flight into the history books.
This is the start of our Around the World Charter, 17 days away for us, where we have a bonding with the passengers. It's a one-off, total one-off. We have to be able to blend together, work under pressure, and to get on with everybody, passengers, crew, everybody alike. Cabin crew, seats to take off, please.
This is just the first leg of our Abercrombie and Kent Round the World tour by Concorde, flying from New York over to Vancouver. I'm Jeff Mussett, the PR on this particular flight, and taking the opportunity to come back and have a word with the passengers. And my job really is to make sure that they're informed of what's going on in the flight, take some of the load off the flight deck crew. We're going supersonic over land, which is most unusual for Concorde, and they've got to navigate very accurately to stick to the flight plan that's been agreed with the Canadian authorities. So what we've done is come north from New York towards Montreal and started a supersonic acceleration 300 miles north of Montreal. And that's taken us right up over Hudson Bay and round north of Churchill, and then we're going to come all the way to the west, down by Peace River in Alberta, down in towards Vancouver, getting about an hour and a half of supersonic flight time. There are very few areas in the world where we can do this, so we're always quite excited to do these overland supersonic segments. We've climbed up now to 55,000 feet, and for some people this is the first time they've been supersonic, so it's a great thrill for them as well.
The excitement in the air was also matched on the ground as last-minute preparations took place for the imminent arrival of this rare supersonic visitor.
Concorde's about to arrive in roughly 10 minutes. It's coming from Kennedy Airport, actually flying out of its way to go supersonic across the top of Canada, and stop here for about an hour 45, and then it carries on to Kona, big island of Hawaii. first time it came here was July of 1986 when Maggie Thatcher came on it to open British Week at Expo 86. It was here once last year, so this is actually the third time it's arrived in Vancouver. We'll get a fair number of people out on the ramp, airline staff that are very interested in an airplane that you don't see in this area very often.
With the vast Pacific crossing still ahead, Vancouver was to prove the most strategic link on the route. This was the most westerly crewed BA outpost on the journey, and as such, successful planning at this stage was to be absolutely critical to the overall success of the entire round-the-world flight. From here on, Concorde was, for all intents and purposes, on her own. Spare parts such as tyres had to be loaded into the rear cabin, and specially trained London-based ground engineers flown out to check every part of the aircraft in fine detail before permission would be granted to allow the flight to depart the 3,000 miles to Hawaii. In addition, 2 highly qualified Concorde engineers travelled aboard in case of problems. One of Concorde's limitations is range in hot conditions, with each additional kilo of weight reducing distance. With a full payload of passengers, all with 3 weeks' worth of luggage and some heavy spare parts, Captain Jeff Mussett had to make some careful calculations, not just for this section, but for the following 2 as well. The most worrying problem for the crew and ground engineers was the second leg of the Pacific crossing from Hawaii to Fiji, which fell at the very limit of Concorde's range. As the new cabin crew, flown out especially from London, prepared for their own trip of a lifetime, the flurry of activity on the ground continued as the minutes ticked away prior to departure. With the first leg of this trans-Pacific crossing over in just over 2.5 hours, the volcanic, and it has to be said somewhat featureless island of Hawaii played host to Concorde Alpha Delta, its passengers and crew, for the next 3 days. Having left the cold and damp of a Vancouver October afternoon a mere 150 minutes earlier, the warm evening sunshine of Hawaii was a welcome boost for all on board. With the workload over for a day or 2, the flight deck and cabin crew chartered a private yacht for a day's snorkeling in the warm Pacific waters. With Concorde's regular route structure largely limited to New York, the temptation amongst the crew to soak up the relaxed atmosphere of the Pacific was a welcome change from the hustle and bustle of midtown Manhattan, and was to prove too much to resist. Hawaii's Kona Airport must be one of the most laid back in America, with open-air departure lounges and an abundance of colourful flowers that made for a pleasant and relaxing atmosphere as passengers waited to depart. Volcanic lava surrounding the runways fast disappearing, Concorde was to head off for its longest and trickiest Pacific sector, across 3,200 miles of nothing but ocean.
There aren't very many spare airfields to go to on the longer segments, and of course you begin to realise how enormous the Pacific is. We're doing 1,000 miles an hour, and yet it takes us maybe 2.5 hours to get from one island chain to another until we get right over to the Western Pacific.
Absolutely, I think we noticed it more when people in Hawaii, who we met earlier, spoke about taking 6 or 7 hours from the West Coast,
yes,
when it took us 2.5
hours. Yes.
What is also quite interesting is our rate of climb here. I mean,
yes,
because we're closer to the equator, in fact, the air is colder at the upper atmosphere, isn't it?
Very much so. Obviously, the lower air is warmer, and then we go through the tropopause when the temperature shears off very quickly. And once we start getting through that, the temperature goes down, then of course the aircraft starts climbing really well again, about 1,000 feet a minute. And we're getting up to more 60,000 feet on these sectors.
Yeah. So of course this is something that wouldn't really happen on a New York run. I mean, you'd be lucky to get to 58,000 feet.
I think in all the time I've been on Concorde, I think I've only got to 60,000 feet 3 times over the Atlantic. And it's odd because the upper air is very cold over the tropics and not over the poles. It's just the height of the tropopause.
Right. What about operationally, dealing with air traffic control? I mean, they're not used to these block altitudes that we fly in. I mean, does that pose its own problems?
We take quite a lot of trouble to get this set up in advance, and certain areas we have to get the permission and get the permits. Once we've got that, then things seem to work pretty smoothly. And once we've cleared 40,000 feet, they're delighted because we've got no other conflicting traffic at all. As we get down towards Fiji, of course, we have got some island chains, and about 500 miles off to the east we've got the Gilbert and Ellice Islands as we cross the equator. But also if you went way off to the east, you'd have Tahiti and so on. Just had a competition to check the time over the international date line, and the prize for that was for somebody to come up for the landing into Sydney. And the nearest person got within 8 seconds of the right time, which was pretty good. We gave them a guide of between 1.5 and 3 hours, so we thought they did pretty well. But of course it's slightly odd because the date line doesn't go straight down 180 degrees east-west. It actually comes down and then peels off towards the east. So nobody could really cheat on that one because they didn't know where we were going to cross it.
From the flight deck side window, the view of Fiji's main island coming into view was a welcome sight for the crew aboard. The imminent arrival of this rare visitor, a cause of curiosity for the local population, some of whom went to extraordinary lengths to get a better view. With sadly only just over an hour to refuel the aircraft, the onboard engineers having to check all the systems were continuing to function properly, there was little time to explore this diverse chain of islands nestled in the beautiful South Seas. As the minutes ticked away and the final preparations were being made for the last leg across the Pacific to Sydney, the passengers were serenaded Fiji style with a dual rendition of the John Denver number on a jet plane.
Every place I go and I'm thinking of you. Every song I sing and I'm singing for you. And I'll come back and I'll bring your waiting ring. So please me, come on for me. Tell me that you wait for me. Hold me like you never let me go. 'Cause I'm leaving on a jet plane, leaving on a jet plane, leaving on a jet plane. Bye-bye, when I strip. Bye-bye.
With the skyline of Australia's most famous city only 2 hours away, the crossing of the world's largest ocean at Mach 2 was rapidly becoming part of aviation history. Having crossed half the world in record-breaking time, the realization of what we'd achieved started to set in. As the passengers continued to enjoy the buzz of Sydney, having covered a staggering 11,447 miles since departing New York, Concorde Alpha Delta was well due for a service. Whilst down under, there was no shortage of Qantas engineers volunteering for the task, under the watchful eye of BA's own Concorde technicians, the supersonic jet receiving a thorough check. With a warning light indicating a possible fault earlier, with one of the aircraft's inertial navigation system boxes, a new replacement was flown in especially from London, ready for Concorde's departure later in the day. 7 days into the trip and 4 sectors behind them. Back in town, the passengers checked out of their luxury hotel for the 20-minute drive back to the departure gate at Sydney's main Kingsford Smith Airport. As they negotiated the Sydney freeways, the crew were already on the tarmac waiting for Concorde Alpha Delta's arrival from the hangar. As the aircraft was slowly towed along the web of airport taxiways towards the gate, with departure only an hour away, the race against time to fully prepare the supersonic jet for departure was to begin. On board, it was literally all hands on deck as the scheduled departure time edged ever closer.
Okay, everybody, as soon as you finish your press, will you give me a shout, because they're dying to board passengers anyway. I know it's difficult with everybody around, but as soon as you get things going, you let me know.
For the southerner. Absolutely.
To add to the complications of the late arrival of the aircraft on the gate, the crew were busy putting the finishing touches to the reroute that would add 2 hours to the journey time.
Originally we were going to be flying supersonically right across the centre of Australia at Mach 2, but because of the situation in East Timor, we're not now flying to Bali, we're flying to Bangkok, and it's just beyond the range of the aircraft. So we're actually going to be flying supersonically up the Gold Coast, past the Great Barrier Reef, to the Pacific island of Guam. There we will refuel and then make a left turn out, crossing the north of the Philippines before landing in Bangkok. Today is going to be a very long sector, as you can see from this map, as we fly all the way to the north here before making this left-hand turn to Bangkok.
With 7,186 miles and a refueling stop in Guam ahead, this sector was to prove the most testing yet for the crew, both in the cabin and on the flight deck.
My first round the world speed record flight of October 12th to 13th, 92. Did Guam Bangkok in 3 hours, 0 minutes and 39 seconds. We got permission to boom Imelda Marcos' hometown, a place called Tacloban, Philippines. We can't do that again. We're going to go around the northern tip of the Philippines, so that's 3 hours and 16 minutes. And some of you also asked me why we're taking such a circuitous routing. The Concorde has a problem with rough runways, and since last summer they've had to measure the runways for roughness everywhere it goes. Nobody ever got around to measuring either Darwin, Australia, or Perth, Australia, both of which would have made for a shorter flight today. Guam, however, has been measured.
After a gourmet lunch at the highest and fastest restaurant on the planet, a view of the Great Barrier Reef was just visible as we flew on the edges of the stratosphere, 59,000 feet up, 12 miles above the Earth.
In the last half an hour or so, we have been just touching 60,000 feet, which is the highest altitude at which Concorde can fly, which is the first time we've done it on this particular trip. And that's because of the very cold air over the equatorial area. We've now started our deceleration into Guam, where we should be landing in 25 minutes. quite a warm, sticky day there. Fresh wind, temperature is 31 degrees Celsius, and that is 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you.
More money offers.
By the time the passengers had reboarded the aircraft, the warm early evening sunshine had given way to darkness, and the only non-daylight sector would begin. As the passengers began to doze, enthusiasm showed no signs of waning in the back.
As you go away, the sun goes down. Just as it's gone down, of course, you get to the north, the sunrise. That'd be good.
This has been my first trip on Concorde. It's an opportunity that I would never ever have dreamt of having, and the takeoff was absolutely exhilarating. You know, the noise and the sheer power was just unbelievable. I'd do it again and again, over and over.
As Concorde flies faster than the Earth rotates, in effect the plane flies back in time. A remarkable effect of departing in darkness shortly after sunset is that Concorde actually catches the sun up, resulting in a westerly sunrise shortly after the sun has already set that day. Concorde was the only civil aircraft in the world that was able to give witness to this extraordinary phenomenon.
This is the first time I've ever been on Concorde. Obviously I fly the 747-400, which I've had a command of for the last 10 years. It's a beaut aircraft, but this thing is just another quantum leap ahead. The performance is incredible. That's the only way you can describe it. It looks very, very sensitive. The pilots tell me it's very nice to fly. The systems are good. Of course, it's older technology, but it seems to work extremely well. And it really gets up and goes. I've never seen an acceleration like it. With a lift-off speed of some 195 knots. That's typically about 40 knots faster than a 747. And a climb-out speed of about 220 knots. That's a lot faster than we go as well. The acceleration from there is just incredible, right through the transonic region. As you can probably see, we're cruising just on Mach 2.0 now, and that compares to the 747 at a Mach number of around about 0.85, so it's a lot faster. On the descent, the approach, it does fly faster. Again, it handles very well, watching the way the pilots fly it. And really, from a pilot's point of view, it's just an awesome piece of machinery. I guess what I'm really saying is I'd love to fly it.
As Concorde descended and decelerated to subsonic speeds over the Philippines, a new day awaited and a new culture dawned as the magic of the Orient came into view. The Thai capital Bangkok was a truly exciting and diverse city, with hotels of unsurpassed luxury, to busy rivers and canals, to the traditions and cultures of the old Siam, which have been passed on from generation to generation. All this just a short ride away from two of Bangkok's most famous sights. The American explorer Jim Thompson's traditional wooden house, and the sensational Golden Palace. The next day, back at Bangkok's international airport, Concorde took her place alongside more conventional subsonic jets prior to heading west over the Bay of Bengal to Madras in southern India. As was always the case when Concorde flew into unsupersonically charted territory, careful additional calculations were made to take into account the weight of the fully loaded aircraft, temperature on the ground, and emergency alternate airfields in case of problems. On this trip, nothing was left to chance.
Well, we're on the move now, just pushed back from our gate here at Bangkok, and we're taxiing out towards the runway. It's a mere 1 hour and 30 minutes across the Bay of Bengal from here to Madras in southern India. Well, Bangkok is to be seen as a city of huge contrasts, but I wonder what our passengers are going to make of our next destination.
Speedbird 990-995 Charlie, clear to land runway 25, wind 200 degrees 10 knots. Affirm and taxi with caution and slower speed.
Even before landing, the heat haze, clearly visible from the cockpit, and the bouncy final approach was a clear indication that the weather outside was to be hot and steamy.
200 feet. 100 feet. 50, 40, 30, 20, 15.
British Airways 990-905 Charlie landed 07. Taxi via Foxtrot Golf. Stand 30. Follow me. Keep.
Foxtrot Golf 30. Follow me.
British Airways 990-95 Charlie. Follow me Jeep is terminating. Follow me service. Follow martial art.
Concorde 990-95 Charlie. Follow martial. Bye-bye.
Bye, and request your departure place time.
Departed Bangkok, just stand by the time.
anywhere in the world was chosen to depict living examples of different centuries, it was India. In the sprawling southern metropolis of Madras, it was easy to find vehicles of the 1950s, together with modes of transport of a truly bygone era. With no direct normal traffic between India and East Africa, the Indian authorities refused to give permission to allow a direct westerly route after departure, posing a massive headache for the crew. With the authorities insisting that Concorde first flies south to Sri Lanka before turning west across the Indian Ocean, the fuel range was to become critical.
Cabin crew, seats for takeoff, please.
With nowhere to refuel along the route, the only way the aircraft could stay the course on this unwelcome longer journey was to depart early in the morning, before the heat of the day limited a takeoff with a full load of passengers and fuel.
We keep the throttles fully forward from the start of the takeoff roll on these sectors, and they stay there until we start our deceleration. So we're using max power all the time, except for when we use the afterburners. And when we reach Mach 2, it will continue to climb until the rate of climb stops, and then our climb is determined by the burning of the fuel in reduction of the weight. And we gradually climb, usually at about 50 or 60 feet a minute, until we hit 60,000 feet, if indeed we get there before we start to slow down. So you can expect to see the climb continue throughout the flight. Thank you.
With some fantastic views of southern Sri Lanka out of the window, rarely seen from the air, let alone at twice the speed of sound on Concorde, this sector was to prove not just one of the most challenging for the crew, but one of the most interesting for the passengers. The normal route between the Indian subcontinent and East Africa is long and tortuous, and normally involves a change in the Middle East. To travel between these two very different worlds in a little over 3 hours was to be a memorable experience.
Well, we're now on our sector across the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
We've left Madras in
Yes.
southern India about 2 hours ago, 2.5 hours ago, and we're now starting our deceleration into Nairobi.
Yes, indeed.
Now, it's been interesting, hasn't it? Because, of course, we've been ducking and diving islands.
Yes, we did a straight acceleration out of Madras, which meant going off the coast of India, but then staying down the east coast of India, going right down the east coast of Sri Lanka, turning right round there, and then heading off across the Indian Ocean.
And that was quite a fun, tight turn.
Oh, it was,
too,
yes. Got a
wasn't
lovely view of Sri Lanka today, yes. And then, of course, we had to make a passage between some of the islands and the Maldives, and then we've come north of the Seychelles towards the African coast. And we're just slowing down now, but it's been supersonic since 11 minutes after takeoff.
And, of course, we've pretty well covered all the ocean.
The Atlantic yet to do, of course. There's the last leg for them. We've done the Pacific, been across Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, and got a couple of lovely supersonic segments to come. One up the Red Sea, which we haven't done before, and another one up the Adriatic to Venice, which is a route we used to do years ago before the Bosnian crisis, but we're going to do that one. And then, of course, we've got the final one across the Atlantic. So.
As Mount Kenya loomed out of the clouds, high above the African plains, the engines were throttled back and the grasslands around the suburbs of Nairobi came into view as we approached the Kenyan capital ahead of schedule. aircraft landed, the crew, who had been aboard since Vancouver, with the exception of Captain Jeff Mussett, prepared to leave the aircraft for the last time, their trip of a lifetime having come to an end.
We're just taxiing into the terminal. We'll be on the gate in just about a minute's time, right on schedule at 11:30. Captain Mussett, I'm sure, has told you, he takes over command of the airplane and flies you for the rest of the round-the-world trip. And your new CSD, cabin service director, will be Nettie Sayers, the new lady in the cabin team. Just remains for the team that are getting off and leaving you here to wish you a very pleasant time here in Kenya and a pleasant rest of your tour around the world. I do wish you a nice time and love to see you aboard another Concorde. Until then, with great sadness, we from the cockpit and the cabin team leaving you say goodbye.
Julie, we've reached Nairobi, and 2/3 of the way around the world. It's been quite an amazing trip, hasn't it?
It's been fantastic. Passengers have been lovely. The crew have all got on really well. We've enjoyed going that extra mile and doing all the special things that you can do on a trip like this. It's completely different to a scheduled New York trip.
What struck me is the sort of the enthusiasm of the passengers versus the New York, where people are really just doing it because it's a business tour.
Yeah.
We get them to New York quickly for
Well,
work.
the attitude's different as soon as they get on board. They're just here to enjoy themselves, and they've all been really nice. Had a great time.
It's been so different because of the type of passenger that we've encountered. They've been so enthusiastic themselves about wanting to come away and visit various cities from all over the world.
And of course, for somebody like you who commutes to and from New York on Concorde all the time, coming to these long-haul destinations is quite unusual.
Oh yeah, it's been great coming to some of these fantastic islands that we've seen. Sydney was probably the highlight. We were invited to the opera, and we've just had a fantastic time.
From the flight crew all the way, down to the cabin crew, we've felt a unique bondness, in fact, not just among ourselves, but also with our passengers that we've looked after. So it's that bond and that closeness and that relatedness that we've built up as a unit of people over the period of the last 2 weeks or so. It's one of the highlights as well.
Having exchanged the leather-clad seats of Concorde for something a bit more down to earth, the awe-inspiring Masai Mara Game Park was to prove Kenya's highlight. Although out in the bush, the passengers were far from being high and dry. The unique game lodge at Kichwa Tembo was to offer a unique mix of fine food and wines in basic yet comfortable and certainly unique accommodation. This was environmental tourism that needed no PR spin to sell it. Six days later, on a rainy morning, Concorde Alpha Delta prepared for departure as a sister BA Jumbo taxied into position after a long overnight flight from London. After takeoff for Jordan and having taken in 8 vastly differing cultures around the world in just over 2 weeks, the passengers had got used to the unexpected. However, they could be forgiven for not second-guessing what was about to be thrown at them.
Here is your trivia question. as we're flying over Djibouti. Djibouti is one of only 3 countries in the world that does not contain any of the letters from the word mackerel. What are the other 2 countries? First correct answer to the Limey tour guide will win a prize.
Well, this is certainly one of the more interesting sectors of the flight. We're presently flying between Nairobi and Aqaba up the Red Sea at Mach 2 at 60,000 feet, the highest the aircraft can fly. It's a particularly precise bit of flying, this, because if we veer off course slightly to the left or the right, there's a danger that the sonic boom can be heard either by Sudan on the left-hand side of the aircraft or by Saudi Arabia on the right. So we have to ensure that flying at these speeds, at this height, that we keep exactly to the path.
Aqaba approach, Speedbird Concorde 95 Charlie. Good morning.
Speedbird 95 Charlie, good morning, sir.
We're still with Cairo, but we're 86 DME from Aqaba, descending to flight level 150.
Speedbird 95 Charlie, roger, sir. No delay expected for runway 01. Report will release from Cairo and request METSA estimate, please.
METSA 37, and understand we can expect a straight-in runway 01.
Speedbird 95 Charlie, just to confirm METSA 1037.
1037, affirm.
As the southern Jordanian airport at Aqaba drew nearer, the crew encountered a communication problem with local air traffic control.
Speedbird 95 Charlie, we no longer have two-way with Cairo.
Speedbird 95 Charlie, understand you lose contact with Cairo?
Cairo control, Speedbird Concorde 95 Charlie.
Cairo, this is Saudi 1371, good afternoon. We are trying to contact Cairo control through the Amman Control Center.
1371 from Speedbird 95 Charlie, do you read?
I copy, sir. I copy, Saudi 371.
Oh, 371. Can you get release from Cairo to Aqaba control for us, please?
With the help of a passing Saudi Airlines jumbo acting as go-between, the desert runway at Aqaba came into view.
Yeah, you see, I think it's just over there, to the left of the other road. Yeah.
From America to the South Seas of the Pacific and onto Australia, from the far east of Asia to India and onto the open grasslands of East Africa, it was now time to enter a different world, that of Arabia.
300. Director? Yes, director.
Jordan is a fascinating Arabian kingdom with a barren yet beautiful mountainous landscape. After 2 days of soaking up desert sun came the jewel in the Arabian crown, a breathtaking example of ancient design. Hewn from the surrounding sandstone mountains, the treasury at Petra. After 2 days, it was time to bid farewell to this beautiful desert landscape and head back to Aqaba Airport, where our small team of dedicated engineers were giving Concorde a thorough check-over before the last few sectors on this historic last ever round-the-world flight.
just come through the gap between Greece on the east and the Tour of Italy on the west side near Brindisi, and that requires some quite accurate navigation. And we've been doing that with our inertial system, which has been making the turns, and we've had that updated from some ground aids. It's done it very nicely. We're now heading up the Adriatic, and we're up at 56,000 feet at the moment. It's particularly interesting for this route, really, because we haven't flown it for some time, and this aircraft used to fly it quite often because it was in the Singapore Airlines colours and was the only aircraft to be painted thus, and used to come down here all the time, of course. Just passed over a load of weather, which is always nice to see from above rather than from the side, and we're actually heading directly towards Venice.
Last stop on this extraordinary tour was this beautiful Italian city. Where better to reflect as the end of such a magical journey drew near than in one of the world's most romantic locations. Venice was to prove a memorable last stop on this trip, with its historic architecture, canals, and famous hand-blown Murano glass. As the 3 days of crisp winter sunshine gave way to wind and rain, last-minute preparations were being made as the passengers boarded Concorde Alpha Delta for the final leg of this amazing supersonic journey across the Med and Atlantic back to New York. In only 3 weeks, we'd covered over 32,000 miles in record-breaking time, taking in a huge range of diverse locations and cultures. Overall, we'd sampled the very best that the planet can offer in a trip that truly made history, breaking 10 world speed records in all. A trip surely hard to beat. As Alpha Delta climbed away into the gloomy November sky, for the lucky passengers aboard, the memories of this extraordinary trip remain vivid and bright. With Concorde now sadly confined to history, short of travelling into space, there can never be a match to this one-off, special trip of a lifetime.
This has been a particularly interesting trip because we have an opportunity to spend a lot more time with each other, the flight and the cabin crew, and also having a ground engineer with us all the way. Barry's been kept pretty busy doing all sorts of checks on the ground, comes in covered in oil, but maintains a great sense of humour, and he's been a real credit to the flight. And I think everyone appreciates that. It's been a real team effort. I think it's the last time I'll be doing a trip like this, as I've only got a few months left to fly, but the last 13 years have been tremendous fun, and particularly when we've done these sorts of trips. Particularly with this, where you're staying with the passengers for quite a few days and you get to know them, and they tend to look on the aircraft as a little bit of home. and I can well identify with that. It's become very much a part of one's life, which is sorry to leave, but have no regrets, because it's been a wonderful few years.
Hello and welcome from the maintenance hangar here at London's Heathrow Airport. Today we're going to be taking you on a journey for the imagination.
Few aeroplanes in the world can conjure up such a sense of awe as Concorde. Into her third decade in service, she still turns heads, and in terms of speed and endurance, can outperform any other aircraft in the world, either civil or military. In this programme, we'll be following BA's fleet of 7 Concordes to various destinations around the world, to New York and Barbados, the 2 regular scheduled destinations. But we also go on tour with some of the special charter operations to places as culturally and climatically diverse as the Arctic Circle and the Middle East. Indeed, Concorde has visited more places than the rest of BA's entire scheduled fleet put together.
Well, with me now is Captain Mike Bannister, the Concorde chief pilot. Mike, a fantastic beast, very beautiful. What's she like to fly?
Oh, she's absolutely marvellous, Adrian. But way before that, there are many things that go on in the background, behind the scenes. For each of us pilots, there are 15 people working on the ground doing all sorts of important things. So why don't we go and have a look at some of that? So here we are, standing in front of one of the British Airways 7 Concordes, this one GBOAC. Concordes are listed from AA through to AG, or Alpha Alpha to Alpha Golf, and GBOAC, or Alpha Charlie as we call her, is, if you like, the flagship of the flagships because she's got the letters of our forerunner airline BOAC. And I'm standing right next to a spare Olympus 593 engine, a Rolls-Royce Snecma engine. And this is one of the 3 key technical things about this wonderful airplane. There's many people that make her fly and many wonderful technical aspects, but 3 key things that I'd just like to take you through as we prepare for that flight to New York. This is one of them, the Olympus engine used on many other different things around the world, but this particular version has reheat or afterburner, and we use that for takeoff and acceleration through the sound barrier to take Concorde supersonic. At takeoff, it has 38,000 pounds of thrust, about the same as 6,000 family cars, and can accelerate us from a standstill to 250 miles an hour in around 40 seconds, or, when we're at lightweight, even faster than a Formula One race car. That's the airplane, that's the engine that enables us to get up and away, set off faster even than a subsonic jet on our way towards the point where we start accelerating to supersonic speeds. So right here, just behind Concorde's main wheels, are the engine intakes. That little engine sits behind this enormous intake. There's a pair of engines behind this intake pack here, and these are very special because as we travel along at twice the speed of sound, 1,350 miles an hour, we've got to slow the air down to a mere 500 miles an hour in just 11 feet. That's the speed that the engines can accept that air, and to do that, we move these panels that are marked of danger up above us up and down to create shock waves inside the intake and slow the air down. And the positioning of those panels is absolutely crucial. It's accomplished by computers designed by a British company way back in the 60s. And the computers that were devised to do that were a real breakthrough in aviation. If there's one thing that made Concorde successful, where the American and the Russian versions weren't, it was the computer that positions those intakes, enables us to fly supersonically for up to 3 hours at a stretch. And the third and final really important element is the wing, the very special features on the wing that keep our center of gravity in just the right place. Apart from the ability to store fuel, Concorde's wing is totally different from a conventional airplane, and so are the flying controls. An ordinary aircraft has ailerons, a rudder and elevators. Concorde has a rudder, but the ailerons and the elevator are combined into what we call an elevon to give pitch and roll control. They're right at the back of the wing. They're drooped down right now because there's no power on the airplane. But when she's powered up, they're smooth, flush and in total alignment, streamlining Concorde for high-speed flight. Also, the wing gives us some very interesting shapes, not only for supersonic flight and for the aerodynamics we need, but also to give us the ability to control the balance of Concorde. To keep her in trim, we pump fuel from a tank right at the front of the airplane to a tank right at the back, to balance the movement of lift as we go faster and faster. But the very clever shape of the wing stops that lift moving too much. Without it, we wouldn't be able to balance Concorde and keep her in trim, and we wouldn't be able to fly supersonically. So those are the three things that are really important technically. The three things that enable her to fly day in and day out to New York, just like she's going to do right now.
With Captain Chris Norris in command of today's daily morning flight to New York, 86 passengers sit back in comfort as aircraft Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Foxtrot taxis towards the departure runway with flight BA 001.
Well, here at the end of the runway at Heathrow, 09 right, some 3 miles behind me, Concorde is getting ready to line up. Every day at this time, 10:30, she takes off from the world's busiest international airport.
With the throttles fully forward, Concorde's performance is staggering. Each Rolls-Royce Olympus engine, complete with afterburner or reheat, springing into life, producing an almost rocket-like performance down the runway.
Rotate.
Shortly after takeoff, whilst climbing at 2,000 feet per minute, the crew prepare to undertake the noise abatement procedure.
3, 2, 1, noise.
This entails reducing the aircraft's power by around 15% and cutting out the 4 reheats to reduce the engine noise for people on the ground. With the reheat cut and the power reduced, it's time to turn Concorde right through 180 degrees so that she heads west towards the Bristol Channel.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, Captain Chris Norris, cruising along now, 26,000 feet at just under the speed of sound. We're estimating arrival in New York, touching down around 10 minutes past 9, just over 3 hours from now, the time in New York, 5 past 6.
Once clear of the coastline, Captain Chris Norris engages full power by opening the throttles to the maximum position, while flight engineer Derek Jackman applies the reheats in pairs. Firstly, the inboard pair on engines 2 and 3, followed by the outboard pair on engines 1 and 4. At this point, everybody on board will have noticed 2 slight nudges in the back of their seats as the extra power kicks in, and Concorde edges slowly towards the speed of sound at Mach 1. As we pass through the speed of sound, the shock wave off the nose of the aircraft is picked up by an instrument just to the right of the artificial horizon. Here it is dancing a little jig as Alpha Foxtrot passes through Mach 1 just off the coast of South Wales. The Mach meter confirms the aircraft's speed, with the crews scanning the instruments to ensure that everything is set correctly for the supersonic cruise.
The pleasure of this being a job of work that we do is that I think we all, without question, enjoy coming to work to fly this aeroplane. I'm not sure that all airline crew could say that. We certainly all very much enjoy flying the aeroplane. We look upon it as being paid to enjoy ourselves, although don't tell British Airways that. I think that is one of the things about the aeroplane, that it is the only machine in the world where people can travel at this sort of speed, in this sort of comfort. If you travel in a fighter aeroplane at this speed, you'll be sitting in a pressure suit, breathing through an oxygen mask, whereas our passengers sitting back there, drinking champagne, flying at more than twice the speed of other aeroplanes, nearly 2.5 times the speed of other aeroplanes, considerably higher up than other aeroplanes. And it is again unique. It's the only aeroplane capable of such performance. Until recently we weren't quite the highest people on the planet because there was the Mir station which had astronauts up in space. But now that that is no longer there, the people on this aeroplane today are actually the people furthest above the planet, and every time we fly the aeroplane, of course, that is the case. Our position at the moment is that we're at 45 degrees north and 57 degrees west. That means that we are to the south of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in Canada. We obviously choose a routing that keeps us over the sea because that means we can stay supersonic all the way to our final descent into New York. The routing that we've done to achieve that is to take off out of London and fly subsonically towards the Bristol Channel, and then when we get to the south of Wales we become clear of the coastline. We can accelerate the aeroplane and climb it up. We have 2 set routings which take us to New York, or one that takes us to New York and one that brings us back again. There's no need to vary the tracks on a day-to-day basis because the winds up here are almost insignificant compared with our speed, so we always use the same routings. We fly along that routing. We have the height from 50 to 60,000 feet to ourselves, so we do what's called a cruise climb. And at the moment the aeroplane is actually climbing very slowly, 56,200, because there is nobody else up here to get in our way. So we just leave the engines on full cruise power and allow the aeroplane to gradually climb up as it gets lighter.
It's hard to believe that in a little over 2 hours in flight we have already reached Canada. We'll be staying southeast of the US coastline in order to stay supersonic and avoid creating a sonic boom on land. The only small area of land visible is Sable Island, a long, narrow sand spit used by the Canadian Coast Guard to warn ships plying the North Atlantic. While ships might be days away from New York at a rate of 23 miles every minute, it's already time for our crew to prepare for the deceleration.
The restriction coming into New York is that we have to be subsonic before we cross the coast, but we in fact choose to do a routing that keeps us off the coast right until we get to Kennedy Airport, so we can stay supersonic right up until the point where we have to start slowing down in order to make our landing at Kennedy Airport. And the way we slow down is whatever height we've got to on the Atlantic crossing, we hold that height, bring the speed back to about 1.5 times the speed of sound, and then we start descending and also continue slowing up back to the realms of subsonic flight, where we mix in with the other subsonic aeroplanes and become just like any other aeroplane landing at Kennedy Airport, controlled by air traffic in New York.
As we prepare for our arrival at New York, the controllers have been passed our details by Boston Control, who have tracked us down the northeast US coast. Although counting for less than 1% of JFK's annual aircraft movements, air traffic control staff hardly bat an eyelid when Concorde comes into land.
Kennedy Airport, Air France, Concorde 001. Air France 002, heavy Kennedy Tower, runway 31 left. Wind shear report, donor loss of 10 knots on approach.
In fact, with Air France's 2 Concorde flights a day, in addition to BA's 4, JFK sees more Concorde movements than any other airport in the world.
Speedbird 1, heavy heading 350.
Head 350.
In order to give the pilots a better view of the approaching airfield, Senior First Officer Rick Reynolds lowers the nose and visor 10 miles out from the airport in order to ensure good visibility of the surrounding traffic. In the meantime, sister aircraft Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Bravo departs JFK for London, shortly before our arrival on the opposite runway. While the tower controllers hands over Alpha Bravo's details to New York departure, who will then give the permission for Alpha Bravo's supersonic acceleration, Chris Norris reduces the power and positions Alpha Foxtrot to the west of the airfield, out over Jamaica Bay, ready for the approach onto runway 13 left. To avoid the noise-sensitive areas to the northwest of Kennedy Airport, all aircraft making the approach on the parallel runways 13 left and right have to undertake a spectacular right-hand sweep, known as the Canarsie approach, rolling out onto finals at the last minute. So as we touch down, Chris Norris engages the reverse thrust and applies the brakes, bringing Concorde from a touchdown speed of around 180 miles an hour to a mere walking pace in a matter of around 30 seconds.
Speedbird 1 heavy, turn right on 22 right at Foxtrot, contact ground point 9.
Right at Fox point 9, Concorde 1. Oh, I thought you were robbed there, Commander.
I thought I was robbed there too.
Robbed of a perfect landing only by a last-minute crosswind. The crew now have the Manhattan streets to contend with. Well, inasmuch as New York is a city of contrasts, so too can be the weather. After weeks of sunshine, the next morning brings with it wind and torrential rain. Testing conditions for one of Air France's Concordes landing on runway 04 right in near zero visibility after its scheduled morning flight from Paris Charles de Gaulle. In conditions like this, airport staff are out in force to check that nothing blows onto runways or taxiways.
Ground 95. 95, ground. On Fox to cross 4 left.
Today it's the turn of Walter Vaughan, an old hand at JFK.
We're now approaching Alpha.
Meanwhile, Captain Ron Weidner and his co-pilot Gary Mitchell checked the impending weather charts at the British Airways Operations Centre at Kennedy Airport. They are waiting to work Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Alpha, the first of the 7 Concordes, on a private charter to Toronto.
Yep, that's it, my love. Unfortunately.
The 48000K indicates the fuel load in kilograms. Meanwhile, Captain Chris Norris and his crew are already on the way for London.
That departure from 31 left at New York is spectacular in those conditions, but it's really very, very exciting in any condition. Perhaps the most complicated procedure that any civil aircraft flies as a departure. That's because we want to be good neighbours in New York. New York is the busiest airport for Concorde, and we want to make sure that we're environmentally friendly. And to do that, just as soon as we're airborne, we turn out over Jamaica Bay, and we climb up to cross over the bridges there with our power cut back. Put a bit more power on, cross over the Rockaways with the power back again before we start accelerating out towards supersonic speeds. That's not something that ordinary line pilots can do straight away, so they come here to the simulator at Bristol, the manufacturers of the airplane are based here, to learn how to fly that particular procedure. It's part of the conversion course, and we do it regularly on our check routines that every pilot and flight engineer go through every 6 months. So here we are in the simulator, a perfect view of New York. Of course, that's computer generated, but the simulator is identical to the airplane, and we're going to show you just the sort of things we do to be good neighbours at New York. So, get yourself strapped in. Here we are sitting on the end of the runway, maximum takeoff weight of 182 tons, a beautiful day, and we're going to set off for London. But first, the noise abatement procedure. So off come the brakes, 3, 2, 1, now. We open the throttles up and slam them open. It's just a computer input. The reheats light up. The airplane starts to accelerate. At 182 tons, the acceleration is already better than probably your motor car. We're traveling at 75 miles an hour, starting to increase speed towards the point where we're going to check the engines are functioning correctly. That's 100 knots, power checked. So we continue to go on up towards the speed where we make a decision to commit to the takeoff. That's called V1. Here we are coming up to that speed now, V1, and approaching the speed where we'll rotate the airplane to the climb out attitude. As rotate's called, I pull back on the control column, pitching Concorde up to about 13 degrees. Shortly after that, we're airborne, positive climb, gear up, turn, roll on 25 degrees of bank. You get an excellent view out of the left-hand side of the aircraft right here as we turn out over the Jamaica Bay, sometimes seeing even the little fishing boats. Accelerating up to 250 knots as we approach the noise time. 3, 2, 1, noise, reduce the power and switch off the reheats, cross over the bridge, and there we are, tippy-toeing out of New York, being really friendly and good neighbours.
The busiest time of day for flights in and out of JFK is normally in the afternoon and evening. For Concorde, it's in the morning. With over 40 Concorde flights in and out of the airport each week, 28 of those tend to arrive and depart between 8 and 9:30 a.m. Of these, roughly 2/3 of BA aircraft, with the remainder belonging to Air France. At the BA terminal, with champagne on ice, smoked salmon and caviar loaded, the BA 002 is almost ready for our passengers, before being pushed back for the departure to London. Meanwhile, Air France's Paris-bound Concorde departure is already negotiating the web of complex taxiways at Kennedy, which will lead her towards 31 left, the departure runway this morning. As the number of subsonic flights waiting to depart from runway 04 left increases, thanks to noise restrictions, both the BA and Air France Concordes have been allocated the empty 31 left runway, ensuring a right-time departure when everybody else is having to line up. At last, it's the turn of an American Airlines Boeing 767 departure for London, a journey that will take over 6 hours. Meanwhile, BA's Concorde passengers are settling back in their seats on Flight 002, which will touch down at Heathrow 3 hours earlier than the American 767, which has already departed, when it is merely halfway across the Atlantic. With the nose and visor down, the crew undertake a complex checklist, checking everything from electrical systems to the flying controls. Meanwhile, the passengers aboard the neighbouring BA Jumbo, also shortly to depart for London, can only look on with envy at Concorde's sleek lines as she glides past majestically prior to her supersonic soiree across the Atlantic in a fraction of the time it takes everybody else. Meanwhile, with 2 departing Concordes to Paris and London getting ready, a third is touching down in the form of Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Delta on the BA1 from London, landing just after the inbound Air France 002 from Paris, which she has followed all the way across the Atlantic at Mach 2. With only 13 Concordes in the world, it's a strange thought that a third of the worldwide fleet of this extraordinary aircraft are under power at the same time, at the same airport every day of the year. JFK produces many an opportunity to see both airlines' fleet at the same time. With the prevailing wind from the north, departing traffic is taking off from runway 04 left. Here, Alpha Alpha waits for a departing TWA aircraft to cross its path before controllers temporarily halt the 04 left traffic to let Concorde cross on 31 left. After a series of left-hand turns, she will commence her supersonic acceleration out to sea and will not see land again until she passes the southern coast of Ireland, near Shannon. Meanwhile, back in London, sister aircraft Alpha Delta prepares for a special training flight to the southern Irish town. Twice a year, Concorde flies to either Châteauroux in France, or in this case Shannon, for a week of training. With no hostesses on board, senior training captain Les Brodie finds himself in unfamiliar territory in the forward galley, much to the amusement of his colleagues, having been offered either chicken or fish. At the sharp end, the training crew, consisting of flight engineer Ian Fellows-Freeman, Captain Jeff Mussett and colleague Andy Barnwell, preparing for this short flight to Shannon. Back in the passenger cabin, 5 newcomers to the fleet take their seats on the aircraft for the first time. By the end of the ensuing week, they will be hoping to swap the leather-clad passenger seats at the back for the coveted prize, a seat at the controls. With the runway in sight, excitement builds amongst the new recruits embarking on this supersonic conversion course, with their days of flying rather ordinary 757s and lumbering jumbos hopefully soon over. After a sporty lightweight takeoff more akin to a space shuttle at Cape Canaveral than a commercial airliner at Heathrow, the enthusiasm amongst the new recruits resembles a class of overexcited schoolchildren on an end-of-term special outing, rather than a group of highly professional pilots. Keeping the speed back to a leisurely 95% of the speed of sound, it's not long before Alpha Delta enters Irish airspace. It's time for Ian Fellows-Freeman to start balancing the aircraft by pumping fuel from one tank to another. As Andy Barnwell steadily manoeuvres the aircraft down the glide slope, Shannon's ground crew prepare for the imminent arrival of this VIP visitor. 150, 40, 30, 20, 50. Shannon will be Alpha Delta's home for the next 4 days as the new recruits take to the skies, flying circuits, practicing those all-important landings which can't be simulated to the fidelity required on the simulator in Bristol.
Hotel that haven't built it yet.
They start off in the ground school learning all about the technical systems of the aircraft, which is vital for further understanding for when they get on the simulator. And we're spending time with them down in Bristol, so we get to know them quite well. The thrilling part, of course, is when they actually get onto the aircraft for the first time, which is what we're doing at the moment. We call this base flying, and both the pilots and the flight engineers fly on the aircraft for the first time, but without passengers. And to see their enthusiasm really rubs off on us. So I think we're all pretty excited by the time we get here.
It's a moment we've been looking forward to for a very long time.
Well, it puts into real life things that you've just been studying in the classroom. You've never sat in the airplane, you've never sat in the seat before, and to look at it and feel at home just reflects how good the course is. You understand the systems, you've flown the simulator, and you sit in the seat, you even know where to go for the seat catchers. Feels familiar, but then of course when you start the engines and the thing actually gets underway, you get all the sensors that you're not used to, the noise and the acceleration that the simulator can't actually show you.
The passenger sits there in comfort and is aware certainly of the noises on takeoff. I think they still feel that as much as we do. But very soon, as far as they're concerned, it's now an airline and it's just trotting along and they're sitting there in comfort reading the papers. For us, it's a fast jet front and an airliner main cabin. And that's the really unique thing about it. They've made something which is not only fast and powerful and furious, but it's also extremely beautiful to look at as well. I think an image everybody holds in their minds of Concorde is Concorde on the approach. Great big sort of stick manta sort of image. There's this one coming down with a long nose out at the front, bent down. And here we're going now. It's a tremendous sound. Just hear the roar, it's fantastic, isn't it? It's a really powerful roar. Tremendous sight. Absolutely stunning.
I think it's fair to say that we do attract enthusiasts. I think people, they've got to want to fly the aircraft. The course is very long. Regular route destinations are fairly limited, but that doesn't seem to matter if you're enthusiastic, because you basically want to fly the aeroplane. So perhaps it's not everyone's cup of tea, but the nice thing is that we do get people coming on the course who have probably wanted to do it for a long time. and that is a very strong motivational force. And when they actually get on the aircraft, flying regularly, and they've got the confidence, it's probably even outstripped their ideas of what it was going to be like.
The first impression is a very valuable moment that I think all of us will cherish. It's fortunately quite a lightweight takeoff, so there's a lot of spare thrust, a lot of excess power, and it certainly accelerates extremely fast, and I'll always be left with that memory of the first takeoff. A lot of vibration, a lot of noise, a lot of very rapid acceleration and very rapid climb, up to 250 knots in a very short space of time. Now, to compare that with military aircraft that I've flown in the past, it's on a par with a lot of them, actually. Yes, if you get a military fast jet at very lightweight, it's probably more sprightly than this, but heavyweight, it's on a par with the Tornadoes and Jaguars and Harriers I've flown in the past. And it reminded me very much of those as well. The vibrations that you get through the airframe, the smell of hot metal which you get from the reheat system, all those things are just like the fast jets that I've flown before, and I really felt at home. I thought, yes, I've come back to a fast jet.
Given the enormity of the task ahead of them, these new recruits could be forgiven for missing the beautiful scenery below. Pints at the local and a dinner banquet at the historic 13th century Bunratty Castle will have to wait until the real work is over. Flying Concorde in tight circuits time after time requires skill and immense concentration.
What the pilot does is lower the landing gear downwind, and when that's down, lower the nose to the landing position. So all the way round onto final approach, the visibility would be set for the landing phase. Once established on the final approach, then the power will be in the high power setting, which will enable the aircraft to counter all the drag which is coming from the big delta wing. And then the pilot is concentrating on going towards the aiming point of the runway, and to do that he must concentrate on looking at the far end of the runway to get the correct perspective. That should be set by a couple of miles out, but as he comes down towards the runway to around 100 feet and passing over the end of the runway, he's then got to think of the actual landing itself. But things happen quite quickly at that phase. It doesn't matter how much you talk about it, it's actually doing it and trying to synchronise the movements of the control column and the throttle and looking in the right place that just make it a little interesting sometimes. Now, as the pilot gets close to the runway, he's going to enter in what we call ground effect, which you can imagine as a cushioning of air beneath this very large wing. So, as he comes down into ground effect, he's going to just check his rate of descent and then about 15 feet from the runway, close the throttles and just maintain the attitude by applying increasing back pressure. Slightly unusually, on this aircraft, once the main wheels are on the ground, we select the reverse thrust, and then we have to lower the nose wheel onto the runway. Bearing in mind, with that attitude, the nose wheel is actually quite high, so you have to assist it onto the runway, and then once the nose wheel's on the runway, we can select the reverse thrust. So the first landing is always very exciting. Usually it's very good, but after about 2 seconds, we'll just say go, and that means that they've got to again apply full power, but this time without the reheat. And then, of course, the aircraft wants to accelerate again. Very shortly after that, we'll say rotate. So again, they pull back on the control column and back into the air.
Shannon is well suited to this sort of training. With a long runway, limited housing nearby and lots of spare capacity, the international airport is a favourite for this sort of operation. During this week in August, with up to 40 touch-and-go landings a day, air traffic controllers in the Shannon Tower see more of Concorde than London, Paris and New York all put together. Tracking BA's Alpha Delta on her final approach on radar, as well as out of the window, the controllers must have an unrivalled view. But for a small group of aviation buffs sitting at the end of the runway, Concorde's unadvertised arrival must have meant Christmas had come early.
fact that there are only 7 aeroplanes means that we're a bit like a flying club within the airline, and everybody who goes onto the fleet is very enthusiastic about the aeroplane. You know, elite is not a good word to use, but I think the fact is that you're working with an aeroplane that you love with people who are enthusiastic. It's a great working environment. And it's a very small team, and that is quite unique in a big airline like ours, to be in such a small team. And that is very nice. It's almost like the old military squadron.
So, after the pilots and flight engineers have finished base training at Shannon, they're 2/3 of the way through their conversion course. Just 2 months to go. Flying the line with real passengers backwards and forwards to New York, our prime destination. The bread and butter, if you like, of Concorde operations. Or should I say the champagne and caviar. That's where they learn the last parts of their training, and then after that, they can fly the line either to New York, to Barbados, or perhaps one of those special flights that takes us to the really exciting places around the world. We've been to 250 destinations all over the globe, 72 of those in the United States and over 20 in the Middle East, including Jeddah, Riyadh, Cairo, Bahrain, but perhaps some of the most exciting are in Jordan.
Back in the 1970s, Concorde flew a regular service to Singapore via Bahrain. Today, the aircraft rarely flies to the Middle East, except on one of Goodwood Travel's special flights to either Egypt or Jordan. Every autumn, Concorde lands in the southern Jordanian town of Aqaba. A short drive along Jordan's southern highway leads us to Wadi Rum, an ancient dried-up riverbed surrounded by towering pink-coloured sandstone mountains, scene of the epic film Lawrence of Arabia. Today, jeeps ply the ancient dirt track through this lunar-like valley, where the views are spectacular just before sunset. Continuing our journey northwards, we reach the ancient village of Tebat Zaman. With a dwindling population and crumbling buildings in need of some basic repair, Jordan's Queen Noor recently supported the transformation of this remote hamlet into a tourist resort. Keeping its traditional charm, the whole village was painstakingly restored to its former glory, preserving the spirit of the past. As soon as you enter, you feel as though you've stepped back a few centuries. Guests stay in individual stone houses, which outside look as though little has changed over the centuries. Inside, the smell of history abounds, traditional furniture alongside the odd 21st century touch, such as satellite television, an eclectic mix of old and new, all encapsulated in a time warp of immense charm. "5 miles down the road, we reach what is undoubtedly the jewel in Jordan's crown, the historic city of Petra. The old city is situated at the bottom of a long, deep and spectacular gorge, accessible only on foot or by horse and cart. Petra was built in the 6th century BC by the Nabateans, a nomadic Arab group who held on to it until 100 AD, despite successive attempts by, amongst others, the Romans to capture the city. At the bottom of the gorge, the view everybody has been waiting for, the treasury. This amazing structure, literally hewn from the rock by the Nabateans in the 1st century BC. Its name, the Treasury, owes more to the fact that later generations, ignorant of its true history, thought that the tomb housed treasures from the ancient pharaohs of Egypt. Its classical style, complete with majestic columns, capitals, and elaborate frieze, owes much to the Nabateans' love of Greek mythology and ancient civilization. First thing in the morning, when the Treasury is in full sunlight, the view is simply breathtaking. By midday, the heat of the sun is too much for even the locals, and so it's time to return to Tebat Zaman. In the evening, the terrace offers a spectacular view over the rugged mountains of central Jordan. As the sun sets on this Jordanian trip, another special flight is just about to land in neighbouring Egypt. Concorde's second foray to the Middle East in less than a week sees an arrival at the Egyptian capital, Cairo. In the nick of time before we were told that cameras were not welcome at Egyptian airports, Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Alpha touches down on this desert runway. What Petra is to Jordan, the pyramids are to Egypt, and understandably prove a popular highlight on the tour. One of the 7 wonders of the world, the pyramids are the only surviving monuments of the ancient world. Built by the pharaohs, they took 100,000 labourers 20 years to build and still stand majestically against the desert sun. Adding to this incredible spectacle is the Sphinx, standing 66 feet tall and 240 feet long, representing the sun god as he rises at dawn. To add entertainment to this first-hand look at these true wonders of the ancient world, guests swap 4 wheels for 4 legs as they head off across the desert in a long camel train. After a 15-minute trip, they arrive at a large Bedouin tent for a banquet, serenaded across the desert by a band, needing perhaps just that little bit of fine-tuning. As everyone prepares to enter the huge nomadic tent, entertainment takes the form of the traditional, performed by the contemporary, in a dazzling spectacle heading the afternoon's lineup of entertainment. The start of this memorable extravaganza in the desert is accompanied by a feast of gastronomic proportions. After locally flavoured brass bands, a belly dancer and a huge lunch, it's time for these colourful traditional Egyptian dancers to take their turn. Or is it a spin? Twirling around the nomadic tent like a human spinning top brings to a close a memorable day in the desert in view of one of the world's most spectacular sights. Incredibly, just a few miles out of the bustling capital, Cairo.
So as we return from Cairo, that marks the end of one of our special flights, and those flights make up about 10% of British Airways Concorde business. 89% is our regular scheduled flights between London, New York and Barbados. The remaining 1% is made up of flights in Concorde's flagship role, doing things that we otherwise would never do, carrying very special people like Her Majesty the Queen and all the senior members of the royal family, and of course many celebrities, some of whom have chartered the entire aeroplane. But we also get used for some very special events. The European Ryder Cup team visiting Boston. That particular trip was interesting because Boston, which we fly past every day, is not one of our regular destinations. A lot of effort and energy went into persuading the Boston authorities to allow Concorde to land there, to bring the team in and carrying the Ryder Cup, and of course we hoping that they'd be carrying it home as well. Concorde's performance in Boston was a pleasure to us all, and the authorities there were delighted to see us, and perhaps they'll welcome us again one day in the future. We also have used Concorde for special occasions like the 1999 state opening of the Scottish Parliament. On that occasion, we flew down Princes Street in accompaniment with the Red Arrows, a spectacular sight for everyone. Right over the top of the Queen's presentation stand, then on over Glasgow, routing back down over the Forth Bridge and back up towards the north. The second occasion that Concorde had flown in formation with the Red Arrows. These sort of flights are really special, and it's in Concorde's flagship role that perhaps we get the opportunity to show off the aeroplane that we love so much.
For many of Concorde's passengers, every flight is a special flight. As winter draws in, the Barbados schedule gets into full swing. Sometimes as many as 3 Concorde services a week link cold winter's Britain with this warm Caribbean island in only 4 hours. Today, the BA 273 is flown by John Tighe, whilst acting as his co-pilot, Max Robinson pops back for a chat with the passengers. After the onboard haute cuisine, passengers wait for the opportunity to visit the flight deck. Although officially a scheduled flight, the atmosphere on board could not be further from the rather serious, quiet nature of a New York run, where more mineral water is drunk than champagne. Flying at Mach 2 as we head south towards the tropics and the air warms at lower altitudes, so the reverse happens in the stratosphere, assisting Concorde to increase her rate of climb. Shortly before the descent into Barbados, Alpha Foxtrot levels off at 60,000 feet, Concorde's maximum altitude, as John Tighe dials up the initial descent level. Behind him, one of the most experienced flight engineers, Ian Kirby, better known as Brains within BA, checks the fuel situation. After lowering the visor and selecting the nose to its initial landing position during the descent, we pass over the northeast coast of the island. Shortly, Alpha Foxtrot turns south along the west coast, 1,500 feet above the Caribbean Sea, passing the chain of luxury hotels scattered along its popular sandy beaches.
Beware Concorde 273 is clear to land on QNH 1016 millibars. The surface wind is 085 at 2 knots.
Just Beware Concorde 273, we're clear to land on runway 09.
Within 30 minutes of touchdown, a number of passengers aboard the arriving Concorde flight have been met by limousine and taken direct to their hotel door. The Colony Club is one such hotel capitalising on this market. Its airy, spacious surroundings of outside bars, lush landscape gardens and refreshing pools prove irresistible to today's arriving passengers, for whom many will have treated themselves to a once-in-a-lifetime trip. While it might be tempting to chill out local style under a coconut tree and take advantage of the many relaxing features offered by the vast number of the island's west coast luxury hotels, there is more to Barbados than meets the eye. A short trip inland from the warm and inviting Caribbean Sea lies another side to this versatile island. In the northern district of St. Peter, a long mahogany-lined country road leads to the historic St. Nicholas Abbey, the oldest Jacobean house in all the Americas. Still inhabited by the same family, this sugarcane estate provides an interesting insight into the Barbados traditional way of life. A drive down the little-frequented Atlantic east coast can be a lot more tranquil with mile upon mile of virtually empty beaches, whilst in the capital Bridgetown, the laid-back pace of life gears up a notch or two as locals and tourists mingle in the crowded streets. This small city, not much larger than an average British or American country town, is where many Bayesians come to work, trade, or simply to meet friends and while away a few lazy hours. In the afternoon, it seems as though everybody is either socialising or relaxing with a bottle. Back at the island's Grantley Adams International Airport, the returning passengers, many of whom have flown out subsonic on the Jumbo, are looking forward to their journeys home as they check in. For 2 of the 3 flight deck crew, it's all in a day's work. Already today's captain, Roger Mills, is busy checking load sheets and passenger lists in the BA office prior to the 4,000-mile drive home. Outside, it's all action as the catering is loaded at the front and the local BA ground engineers give Alpha Foxtrot the routine once over. with seemingly every possible member of ground staff swarming around the aircraft like bees at a honeypot. At the back, the passengers' baggage is being loaded into the hold. Concorde operates at the very limit of its range between Barbados and London, so fuel tanks are fully topped up before departure to reduce the need for a fuel stop. Meanwhile, the cabin crew board to ensure that everything is neat and tidy for the passengers. On the ground, loading all the travellers is not a quick affair, as everybody seems to want to take that souvenir photograph on the tarmac before they take their seats.
Speedbird Concorde 272, runway new 09, QNH 1015 millibars, temperature 30, the wind is 090 degrees, 10 knots, and the time 27.
Roger 1015, and the weather cockpit, Speedbird 272, just starting engines now.
On the flight deck, Captain Roger Mills on the left and Senior First Officer John Tighe make final preparations for the flight back to Heathrow. The departure is from runway 09 in an easterly direction, out towards Barbados' southeast coastline.
Concorde 272 is now cleared for takeoff. The wind is 090 degrees, 10 knots.
There, take off, Concorde 272. 3, 2, 1, now. V1. Rotate. V2. Positive climb. Gear up.
After a couple of hours of sustained supersonic flying across the Atlantic, we continue to head along our supersonic track, northeastwards past the Azores. Flying at this height and speed against the sun can cause this dark band seen through the visor at 57,000 feet. It's the reflection of the setting sun against the stratosphere. Meanwhile, as we head back to London during Christmas week, Goodwood Travel have laid on a seasonal special flight to Lapland to see Santa. The few hours of daylight in the Arctic Circle proved popular with young and old alike, where, despite the bitter cold, sleigh rides raise spirits. While enjoying a chilly lunch by the campfire, Alpha Golf approaches Rovaniemi, the setting sun providing a stunning backdrop. Within a couple of hours, these temporary Arctic explorers will be leaving this dramatic scenery for the return to London. As the temperature drops, flying in and out is not without problems, from defrosting Alpha Golf to evicting stowaways who have decided that Concorde is quicker than Rudolph and Sleigh.
Okay, everybody, let's go to London.
Go for it. Meanwhile, Alpha Foxtrot from Barbados is almost on home ground as she turns right over the River Thames on a dark, cold December evening. It's hard to believe that only a few hours ago her passengers and crew were basking in the Caribbean sun. To many, Concorde is an essential time machine, linking London and New York in a matter of only 3 hours. But whether it's sunny beaches in the Caribbean or a winter wonderland in the Arctic, Concorde proves a quick and versatile means of transport. Her ability to fly faster than a rifle bullet at twice the speed of sound can literally bring together seasons and continents in a matter of a few hours. As we touch down on this cold winter's evening, for most of the passengers, this once-in-a-lifetime experience will be truly unforgettable. Exeter Airport, July the 16th, 2000, and excitement builds amongst the spectators gathered in the surrounding lush green fields as Concorde takes to the sky on this warm summer afternoon. For 3 decades, this paradox of today's aviation world has been turning heads wherever she makes an appearance. Although aging gracefully, arguably still the most potent symbol of Anglo-French prowess, she's not simply an aircraft, but a symbol of pride and affection. One week later in Paris, a single event would change Concorde's history.
When I first heard the news that Concorde had crashed, it was like a blow to the gut. I couldn't believe it, and yet I had to believe it.
The thing I think that was profoundly shocking, as far as I'm concerned, is that I'd almost reached the rather naive position that somehow Concorde was above all the normal aerodynamic laws and that the airplane was immortal, that it never would crash.
I first heard about the accident when my wife Chris and our daughter Amy were going on holiday. We were going across the Atlantic on the QE2 and we'd literally checked in and our baggage was in the cabin. We were walking up the gangplank for a holiday when my pager and phone went off at the same time. The message was, ring British Airways Operations Control urgently, and I did, and I got the first indications of what had happened. And at that stage it was only just an indication that there had been some sort of an accident.
There was this icon that suddenly everybody had loved, and it had failed in some way. It was an extraordinary moment. And at the end of my wonders, I said to myself, I wonder if Concorde will actually fly again.
It was obviously a most unusual sequence of events, the like of which we had never either seen nor could have anticipated. And it didn't alter my basic idea that the aircraft was very safe.
My initial reaction was to call my counterpart in Air France and see if there was anything that we could do. And then get in the car and go straight back to the control centre, dropping the family off en route. And I reappeared at home 48 hours later and looked my daughter in the eye and had to apologise about the lost holiday. But I said to her, you do understand, don't you, why I'm doing this? And she said, yes, you're making sure it never happens again.
For both Air France and British Airways, the sense of shock was overwhelming. The flagship of the fleets was immediately grounded, but within 24 hours of this terrible tragedy, a different sequence of events was starting to unfold. While Air France kept their remaining fleet of 5 supersonic jets firmly on the ground, after exhaustive checks and cancelling that evening's flight, BA decided to restart London-New York services the following day.
For Air France, the whole thing must have been utterly traumatic in a corporate sense, traumatising, really. And I think that explains why Air France felt they had to ground the aeroplane, if for no other reason than that they felt they needed to sort of get the trauma out of their systems, so to speak. Equally, I think it explains why British Airways felt that having put certain extra checks in place, like a runway sweep before every Concorde departure, it was perfectly reasonable and justifiable to carry on operating the aeroplane.
The French were livid at the British decision, describing the timing at best as somewhat tasteless. With the entente cordiale seemingly in tatters, BA's crisis management team were not only quick but bullish in justifying their position.
Working with the accident investigators, the manufacturers, Air France and everybody involved, we knew pretty quickly the essence of what had happened. We reviewed all that we did. Over that night we put a lot of checks in place, we did a fleet-wide check on a number of areas, and we reviewed our decision to continue operating on a daily basis.
BA's gamble was starting to pay off. Despite a few high-profile cases publicly switching from supersonic to regular subsonic flights, the majority of Concorde passengers remain largely undaunted and continued to pay the £7,000 price tag to fly between the British and American commercial capitals. Despite enormous press coverage, the crash, it seemed, had done little to dent confidence, although the future of the plane was in serious doubt.
It was a very easy matter to ground just a handful of Concordes. It wasn't going to affect a huge number of air travellers. It was going to have no impact on the global aviation scene.
And one's got to say that it would have been very difficult for the authorities to have, for instance, withdrawn the certificate of airworthiness of a Boeing 737 on the basis of a single crash, because there are so many of them flying. It was much easier in the case of Concorde, with only 12 examples flying, for that certificate of airworthiness to be withdrawn.
I think when the C of A was withdrawn for a very short time, it was a little bit of a surprise, but then immediately after that, really, the focus shifts from that to everything that needs to be done to get it back once more. I've never had any doubt that we'd succeed in getting the certificate of airworthiness reinstated and that Concorde would return to commercial flight. And it was from that moment, the very day that it happened, that our energies were pointing forwards rather than looking back.
To prepare the aeroplane to regain a certificate of airworthiness after it was taken away on August the 16th, 2000 last year, we had to do a series of modifications, and these were agreed with the manufacturers and the authorities and the airlines as the way to make the aircraft safe from what they learnt from the accident that happened in Paris last year.
I think the great thing that's happened has been there's obviously enormous cooperation between the manufacturers, airworthiness authorities, airlines in the interim, and a real determination to see the aircraft back in service. And I think the reason that's come about is because basically the aircraft is very sound and very strong, and people have got a belief that there was nothing basically wrong with the aeroplane.
What the accident investigators revealed was that this accident was a series of unique events. Firstly, there was a uniquely shaped piece of metal on the runway that led to a unique tyre destruction. The tyre manufacturers have said they haven't seen anything like that in 40 years. A large piece of tyre flew up and hit the underside of the wing and caused a massive fueling in a mechanism that had never been known before in civil aviation. A large piece of wing skin was forced out, from inside to out. Not a rupture from outside to in, but from inside to out, releasing a massive amount of fuel. That fuel was ignited and led to the massive fire. What we've done is to make sure that can't happen again by breaking the chain in 3 separate places. A new tyre that can't be cut or can't be destroyed in the same way, and if it is damaged, it releases far less energy. A new wing panel. Inside, we've got liners made of Kevlar, so you can't get that type of leak again, and ignition sources have been isolated, so you can't get the spark. And in that way, in 3 independent ways, we've ensured we can never have the fire and then therefore never have that accident again.
And the modification in itself was just fairly simple in nature, but very complicated to execute, because it meant lining the bottom of the tanks, the vulnerable tanks above the main landing gear that could receive FOD damage, foreign object damage that is, if a tyre should burst. To achieve that, all the pipework had to be taken out of the tanks, all the equipment, all the pumps and gauging equipment, etc. You can imagine that's quite a task. Plus a lot of the structure is supported within those tanks with rods that go from top to bottom to give the strength within the wing. They had to be removed. So as you can see, it turned into a colossal job. The liners themselves had to be designed, and that was done in Toulouse and then manufactured also in France. And these liners
had to be fitted in a particular spot, so that meant you had to code each liner and measure it up against a drawing, and then that took a lot in itself to prepare before you even got the liner into the tank. The engineers have put their heart and soul into this project, and they've been ups and downs. They've seen challenges that looked almost impossible to start with, but they kept with it, and now thanks goes to those engineers for their hard work, because without them doing that, we would not get the aeroplane back in the air again.
During the modification programme, one of the things we've been asked is how much longer Concorde will be in service. Well, she's in aeroplane years still very young. She's done about the same number of flights as a 4 to 5-year-old Boeing, the same number of hours, same number of takeoffs and landings. And yet she's in great condition, because each time we take her supersonically, she heats up, and any moisture that may have got inside evaporates away. So as well as just being equivalent to 4 to 5 years old, she's also bone dry inside and in great shape. And with that sort of legacy, we can continue operating Concorde at least until the end of this decade, and probably beyond.
The whole modification programme was closely scrutinised by former pilot, historian and author Christopher Orlibar, who witnessed firsthand the aircraft's earlier turbulent history.
When Concorde went into service with British Airways, the management were not keen, and if you wanted to get anywhere in British Airways, you didn't show an interest in Concorde. That management soon left. It was replaced by Lord King and Sir Colin Marshall as they are now. The idea that Concorde would be a flagship gained force, so the figures on Concorde improved. We negotiated with government in the early 80s to such an extent that the government was then absolved of any financial involvement in the Concorde project. And as that happened, the costs of maintaining Concorde and maintaining a watching brief on Concorde, which the manufacturers have throughout the life of an aircraft, switched from government finance to airline finance. And from that point onwards, we never looked back.
The aircraft, of course, was designed for a particular route, transatlantic between Western Europe and northeastern the USA. And that's where she excels. Supersonic flight for over 3 hours, and there's nothing else in the world that can do that. We have used her in the past on subsonic flights, but she's not so efficient there. Clearly, it's the supersonic route from the UK and from France to New York that's the prime route for Concorde, and that's where she's at her best.
For over 20 years now, Heathrow has been the starting point for this popular Concorde route. Up to 100 captains of industry and other well-heeled travellers converge on Terminal 4 for the start of their 3-hour, 20-minute flight.
There's no question it saves not just the hours of the day, it saves the days of the week by making day one an effective one on the other side of the Atlantic.
Really, I suppose everybody was a businessman in one sense or another. Either they were businessmen in the sense that you and I would think about it, or they were sports stars, actors, pop stars, people to whom time was money.
Then you come back on day 2, midday, arrive 10 o'clock in the evening Europe time, and go to work on day 3 back in Europe. Marvellous.
In the early 1980s, with a fleet of 7 Concordes available for essentially one route to New York, it became clear that there was plenty of spare capacity in the fleet for new and innovative ideas to develop. The aircraft's high operating costs, range and a ban on supersonic flights over land pretty well rendered any further economically viable scheduled routes useless. In the light of these limiting factors, but with spare aircraft on the ground, the charter market was born, aimed at a completely different clientele.
For some people, it was just the flight in itself. That was the be-all and end-all, and for that magic hour and a half, they'd be taken into another world. And most of them were really thrilled by the experience.
They were tremendously rewarding to fly. I mean, it was just wonderful to have them on board.
There's no doubt that charter passengers on Concorde almost feel as if they're going into some holy place. They've heard about Concorde, they've read about Concorde, they've seen Concorde, and now at last they're actually going to fly on Concorde, to experience this twice the speed of sound, this flying to the threshold of space where the atmospheric pressure is 1/10 of its value at sea level. And if you look carefully, you can just about see the curvature of the Earth.
Bournemouth's Herne Airport is one of the more regular haunts on the regional circuit. Bournemouth has seen Concorde charter flights to places as far afield as Pisa, Venice and Tenerife, as well as quick trips out over the Bay of Biscay and back in an hour and a half. These flights were not only rewarding for the passengers, but also proved an exciting day out for the crews, more used to the confines of one regular route to New York with generally disinterested passengers.
I think one of my abiding memories is flying an elderly lady. I think by elderly I mean seriously elderly. I think she was 101. She was over 100 anyway, and she had never flown in her life before. And she decided that before she died, she was jolly well going to have a flight to see what it was like. And she decided that if she was going to have a flight, it was going to be on Concorde, because that was the only way to do it. And she came on this flight, had a wonderful time, drank lots of champagne, and got off the airplane full of the joys of spring. She had an absolutely superb ride.
Often we'd have to fly around to get our weight down to a landing weight. So under the radar of the control, we'd actually have a little bit of spare time to kill. So we'd probably fly long off the coast of Bournemouth before we were down to landing weight.
When a Concorde lands at Bournemouth, the event is normally marked with a vintage flypast from the local Jet Heritage Museum. But it's not only classic aircraft that hold a South Coast association with the supersonic jet airliner. Just along the coast at nearby Southampton, a number of Concorde passengers, having just arrived from London on the Orient Express, continue their journey to New York on the QE2 before returning to London a week later on Concorde. An irresistible combination.
Well, they're wonderful ways of transport. In fact, you can do all three. Go on the Orient Express to or from Southampton, to or from New York on the QE2, and to or from New York on the Concorde. And if you want to get three all inside a week, that must be the way to do it. I've been lucky enough to go on all three, and I wouldn't like to differentiate between them because I like all modes of transport. Some are just a bit quicker than others. I always think the QE2 is classic. It's like Concorde insofar as they came from a particular generation when you built and tested things very, very thoroughly. The QE2 will be able to encounter and overcome any weather that you could throw at it at sea. Good draft, very solid, built for the North Atlantic. And it's the same with the Concorde. It's a very robust aircraft. And I always think that they're two very, very special modes of transport specifically designed for that environment. So I think when you've done the two of them, you've probably experienced the ultimate in designer travel.
It's the ultimate irony that the passengers embarking on this voyage to New York will have paid much the same amount to take 6 days to get there as they will have done to return in only 3 hours on Concorde.
It's always appealed to everybody's sense of what an aeroplane should look like, and there's a theory that says it appeals to both sides of the brain, the scientific side and the artistic side. Concorde has always done that, and it's funny that it's rather like some other things in life, like steam trains. I'm particularly keen on railways and steam locomotives, and there seems to be a link between the way that those sort of things appeal and the way that Concorde appeals.
For those not able to afford the time or high price tag associated with an Orient Express QE2 and Concorde New York tour, there were always less costly alternatives available. Run by the pioneers of Concorde charter travel, a day trip through the Garden of England to Canterbury by the Orient Express, pulled by a steam engine, and returning on Concorde from the nearby Manston airfield proved a popular alternative.
Manston's particularly interesting because we usually come in off the North Sea. We've taken off, gone up and done a loop around the North Sea, come back past North Foreland Lighthouse, and then approaching Manston, it looks very different because it's got a very wide runway. Some runways are shorter than the standard of 46 metres and others are wider, and Manston, being an ex-military airfield, is actually considerably wider, so the perspective looks very different.
Ironically, Manston provides a constant reminder that in today's competitive aviation marketplace, aircraft that have outlived their usefulness are unceremoniously put out to grass. With greater scrutiny being placed on commercial viability, regional charters that use up valuable aircraft cycles could well prove to be a thing of the past. Even prior to the accident, BA was privately weighing up the financial returns of such trips, the key objective of preserving the fleet's life as long as possible for the core business route to New York. Ironically, the month of the Paris tragedy also saw some of the busiest regional charter programs in the UK in the aircraft's history. On the 3rd of July, Glasgow played host to a private charter from New York with a group of American golfers visiting Scotland for a week-long tour. With the evening backdrop of the hills around Loch Lomond as Concorde prepares to return empty to London, many BA staff in Glasgow were already asking themselves whether their airline's flagship would ever return north of the border. A week later, Concorde was out on another UK regional tour, this time to the Midlands and North West.
Well, there's no question Concorde is an aircraft which turns the heads of people who have no need to fly on it. It's just almost a question of being part of a country which was capable of putting such a beautiful aircraft into the air.
Even on the very short 1.5 hour round the bay flights, we used to get all the passengers up during the course of the flight for a quick peek at the flight deck. And just to look at their faces and the sort of wonderment on their faces was tremendously rewarding.
People who had always wanted to do it, who now found themselves terminally ill. The group of people who'd had the same milkman for years and years and clubbed together to give him a ride with his wife. You can go on and on with people for whom it was really something very, very special.
It's absolutely remarkable. I mean, there's this airplane travelling faster than a rifle bullet on the edges of space, 23 miles a minute or something it's going at when it's going at top speed, and it feels as though you're hanging suspended in space. The only thing that tells you that you're moving is that occasionally when you're flying over the subsonic aeroplanes, you can see all these 747s 20,000 feet below you, almost appearing to go backwards. I mean, you are going 800 miles an hour or thereabouts faster than they are. The airplane was an absolute delight to fly. It handled beautifully. And remember, we're talking about an airplane that was being designed in the late 1950s, mid-1960s. I think it's absolutely amazing. And here we are now in the 21st century, and it remains unique.
After pulling in the crowds at Birmingham and Manchester, the aircraft's busy summer schedule turns to the southwest as another BA Concorde prepares to drop in and an air of anticipation builds amongst the spectators. With the airport laying on extra car parking in nearby fields and donating the proceeds to charity, it was clear that after 30 years in the air, this symbol of Anglo-French pride still turned heads.
When you're watching Concorde's approach, everybody's out there. They find a reason that they must be out on duty on that day, and everybody's straining to try and see it, the first landing light coming from the distance. And we're lucky because we have such a clear view. It's unrestricted, unlike some of the major airports where it probably gets lost with a lot of buildings and other things. From here you can see it, and you start to build up the adrenaline, and the excitement is phenomenal. It's quiet, and then all of a sudden the roar of Concorde, the adrenaline is bursting. It's amazing the amount of emotion it can give people.
It reminds me of a period early in my career when I was on the Viscounts, and we used to fly around the Scottish Islands and down to the Channel Islands and lots of other little airfields. And I think when you go to those places, it just gives you a feeling really of roots of serving communities. And certainly the flying is interesting, landing on the shorter runways and negotiating the tighter taxiways, and crowds of people there pressed up against the fence, and just the enthusiasm of the staff on the ground is another thing that really struck you.
With the pilots obviously enjoying themselves raising and lowering the long droop nose in front of an adoring audience, this weekend provided an extra bonus. Concorde was to be outstationed for the whole 2 days.
Our normal operation would see flights to the Balearics, Canaries, Greece, Cyprus, and we do have a transatlantic flight to Canada, but it's not the same as Concorde. That has something so different. People talk about it forever after Concorde. It just means so much.
The same weekend, the airport was renamed Exeter International, with Concorde as the star guest of the show. But although both local press and public were out in force to mark the occasion, as ever, it was Concorde's presence that made the local headlines. The following day, even bigger queues had developed to try and catch a ride on the star attraction.
People will even turn up for a last-minute opportunity with a fistful of money because they're so desperate to get on Concorde when, of course, it's full and they've missed it, that they'll have to queue up for the next year. As soon as Concorde's been here, they're already looking at next year and so on, because they know that they've got an anniversary or a birthday or something or other they want to celebrate. So they're all so keen, and once they've seen it at Exeter, it means so much more. Whether it's coming in or going out, it has a thrill for everybody to say, well, I've been on there, I've been on Concorde. To them, it's only up the road that it was built. So many people who've travelled to see it have worked on it in the past. We have a lot of people who were engineers, or they did something with regard to the start-up of Concorde, and so they have an allegiance towards it and just love to watch it come in, and they've always got a story to tell when they worked on it. And so they feel it's very much part of the West Country, although we're at the Southwest. It's still the West Country, and it's our aeroplane, really.
For the crews, charters represent something out of the ordinary, and it's this sense of adventure that proves attractive. However, the window of opportunity for new pilots to sign up to this exclusive club comes up rarely.
I think generally they're real enthusiasts. There are a number of reasons for this, partly because of the limited route structure in everyday life, partly because they have to stay on the aircraft for a number of years, so their career opportunities may be curtailed in the meantime. And I think it's pretty true to say that all the time I've been on the aircraft, all the people who've come on it or wanted to come on it have been very, very keen to do so. They're not put off by the fact that probably 3/4 of their trips will be to New York. They just want to get on the aircraft.
There we were, ordinary pilots flying, having the luck to fly such an extraordinary aircraft, such an interesting aircraft, such a historic aircraft, at the same time as being way ahead of its time, in its time. Quite extraordinary.
It's an airplane that captures the imagination and the heart of any pilot or flight engineer.
But there's also that great feeling that you're amongst a small group of people, by necessity, because we don't need that many crews. It's rather like playing regularly in a sports team. You build up a good feeling of camaraderie and some general interest and enthusiasm.
I think the hardest thing is that every sense is assailed by flying this aeroplane. I think that what the simulator can't prepare you for is the noise, the acceleration, the fact that absolutely every sense is overloaded. It's a wonderful machine, and it's very difficult not to sound trite. It's a superlative aeroplane, and the only words you can use to describe it are superlatives, really.
Selection brings jubilation for the new recruits after taking control of Concorde at Shannon for the first time and gaining their supersonic wings. For BA's retiring pilots at the age of 55, leaving the Concorde fleet to the newcomers leads to mixed emotions.
I spent 15 years on that aeroplane, and I never once drove up to Heathrow feeling that I wished I wasn't doing it. There was always that eager anticipation that I was about to get back into the flight deck of my favourite aeroplane. I mean, I've flown well over 70 different types of airplanes, including helicopters and seaplanes and all sorts of things. And there is nothing that compares with Concorde. It comes into a very special category. It's the Grand Prix racing car, the Epsom Derby winner of the flying world, without any doubt at all. I think it was Sir Hugh Casson, the British architect, who described Concorde as a piece of 20th century sculpture. And I think that describes it very neatly, actually. And it is, in a sense, the fusion of art and technology in an absolutely sublime way.
How did you feel on your last flight when you landed back to Heathrow?
Absolutely devastated. Awful feeling. Knew it was coming. I mean, you know you're going to be retiring, but there you go.
When we got out to the aircraft in the morning, it was a lovely New York morning, as only those mornings can be. Fresh, lovely bright blue sky, and smashing flight back. Smooth flying conditions, wonderful visibility, and came back to London also on a lovely, clear, calm evening. And I thought, if you've got to finish, that's the way to do it. Quick kick of the tyres when you leave, and then the realisation you're not going to do it again.
It's a dreadful feeling, that last flight. I really had withdrawal symptoms for, I don't know, a year, 18 months. And eventually I sort of had to pull myself together and say, come on, Hutchinson, there are other things to do. And another life to be got on with. But, you know, initially, for the first year or so, I really was a very, very grumpy old man.
I made a decision not to fly commercially again because I didn't feel that anything was going to be as good as the previous 13 years, and it's a decision I haven't regretted.
For Jeff Mussett, retirement was perfectly timed, just after flying the ultimate route on the ultimate aircraft, a trip travelling at twice the speed of sound around the world. This late 1999 modern-day aviation adventure, chartered by a group of wealthy Americans, is almost certainly never to be repeated. After being carefully groomed for this trip of a lifetime, this BA Concorde was backed out of the hangar at Heathrow for the start of this epic voyage. After picking up the passengers in New York and flying supersonic over the frozen wastes of northern Canada, the first stop was Vancouver to refuel. As Concorde approaches the first stop away from her normal London-New York routine for the first time on this trip, the logistical complications became apparent. Special engineers and ground staff had to be placed, as well as a resident on-board engineer who travelled with spanner in hand at the back of the plane.
The problem with an aircraft like Concorde is that, unlike a 747, we don't maintain stocks of spares around the world. We have to take engineers as spares with us. But contrary to that, because one stops for 2 or 3 days, everywhere in the world is within reach of getting a spare to the aircraft.
After literally an hour on Canadian soil, Concorde heads for Hawaii. To cross the Pacific at Mach 2 is hugely deceptive, with the vast tracts of ocean gobbled up in a matter of only a few hours. Destinations ahead included Fiji, Sydney, Bangkok, Madras, Nairobi, Petra and Venice. In a matter of 3 weeks, staying in the world's most luxurious hotels, the holidaymakers on this flight would not spend $80,000 per person to travel on anything less than Concorde. On board, the service was exemplary.
I think the beauty of a round-the-world trip like that is that you start at a sensible time in the morning. So you've had breakfast, you have a pleasant lunch, and then by the time that's cleared away, you're landing, and you still feel fresh, and you've covered 3,500 miles.
These sun-drenched beaches are about as far from Heathrow as you can get.
Fiji was fascinating because, again, crossed a large segment of the Pacific Ocean in a short time and gone from American culture down into the South Seas. And it must have been wonderful to have seen the aircraft arrive against the backdrop of the beaches and the palm trees. And flying in, of course, we got exactly the reverse insofar as we were looking out from our little world down onto this palm-fringed paradise.
Although this unique trip broke several world speed records, back home at Heathrow the BA policy was shifting. No longer would the charterers be given carte blanche to hire the aircraft, as preservation became the new priority. In order to protect the airframes for the core New York service for as long as possible, extensive maintenance was being undertaken on the entire fleet to keep them in perfect order. Following the Paris crash and the subsequent grounding of both airlines' fleets, both BA and Air France had the perfect excuse to retire the entire fleet of aircraft on the grounds of cost. But to the surprise of some, while record-breaking trips around the world are confined to the record books, the future for this 1960s needle-nosed aircraft was looking up.
Anybody who's in business knows that you have to keep reviewing your business plans, and at some time, rather like all of us with an old car perhaps, you decide that the time has come to buy a new one or to undertake the major capital expenditure to put a new engine or whatever you want to do with it. And I think that had been an ongoing process. This obviously refocused it. The aircraft is expensive to maintain and keep running. It requires a lot of engineering man-hours, and that argument was probably finely balanced. And obviously the decision was made to actually go ahead, which I think is a great vote of confidence, because I think it was a hard-nosed decision. I don't think it was done out of sentiment. I think the belief was there that it could continue to make money if it came back in service.
During all the time that Concorde's been on the ground, we've kept in close contact with our regular customers. And what they're continuing to tell us is they really miss the ability to buy back time. To travel across the Atlantic and do in one day what would otherwise take 2 or 3, and in 2 days what would otherwise take 3 or 4. To really gain time by arriving before you leave. We've also asked them how the tragic events in New York will affect them. And 3 of the key messages coming back are they want to get to and from New York very quickly, they know most of the people on board and we know them all, and they're now having to do perhaps even more work than before. And so for those 3 reasons, we have a great level of confidence that the market is there and will continue wishing to fly Concorde on into the future.
A huge amount of time had passed with the entire Concorde fleet grounded at Heathrow, their future uncertain. For the regular passengers, it had been a long haul across the Atlantic on ordinary jumbos. So when the first Concorde took to the air, kitted out with Kevlar fuel tank linings, new tyres, and even new seats on a test flight, there was a sense of anticipation mixed with jubilation for the hundreds of staff who had worked to get this flagship back in the skies.
Of course, Concorde really enjoys, like all aeroplanes, being in the air, and over the last 15 months or so, she's not really been doing that. Nevertheless, we've been looking after her in a very thorough special care and maintenance program. Regular engine runs, regular checks of systems, taxiing around, making sure that they're in tip-top condition. And before each aircraft is returned into service, we take them up for a handling flight, just to make sure everything's functioning as it should be. And that way we've kept Concorde in prime condition, ready and waiting to go back where she belongs.
On the other side of the channel, on the 3rd of February 2001, an Air France Concorde returns to Paris Charles de Gaulle, scene of the terrible accident following tests at a military airbase at Istres near Marseille. By this time, Air France had gained special permission from the civil aviation authorities to fly a series of one-off test flights to test the new Michelin tyres, designed to withstand impacts at high speed. By the early part of 2001, BA and Air France had put their differences behind them and decided to pool their resources and worked in close cooperation. While BA concentrated on testing the Kevlar-fitted fuel tanks, Air France was busy testing their new tyres, made of rubber and Kevlar. 3 months later, after successful initial trials, the test aircraft flew the short distance from Charles de Gaulle to Orly Airport for maintenance.
Oh, ce travers, magnifique!
This test flight giving the pilots an opportunity to brush up those flying skills. Within days, this same aircraft was almost unrecognisable, completely covered in masking tape ready for a respray prior to re-entering commercial service in November. After successful trials at Istres, and with the certificate of airworthiness regained, Air France now had the clearance to retrain their pilots on the fleet. Châteauroux in the Loire region on September the 14th was chosen because of its long runway and uncongested airspace, a perfect environment to perfect touch-and-go landings, an essential part of the retraining process. Back in BA pastures, the priority was to get the New York service back in the air by the 7th of November, for which a minimum of 3 aircraft were required. With the first test flight deemed a success, the priority now was to get the other 2 back in the air and refresh the crews. The roar of the Olympus engines, a disturbing return for some of the locals, grazing near the end of the runway.
Since we've started flying again, it's a delight to see the welcome from other pilots, air traffic control, and from the public in general, to see people looking up again when Concorde flies.
The ground engineers have been working around the clock to get the Concorde fleet back in the air, and as a thank you for the chance to check the modified aircraft with a full passenger load, a special flight was arranged to take them halfway across the Atlantic and back to Heathrow. Meanwhile, back at base, the last of the 3 refitted Concordes was about to take to the skies.
For a technical assessment flight, we normally start off from base, which is just here, just outside the window here. And we're hooked up to a tug that's got a ground power unit on that gives us the power supply to run all our systems while we get our checks done before starting the main engines. And we're towed across. Just at the end here is the perimeter road that goes around the airport, and there is a crossing there. And we're towed across that crossing by the tug. We have to get air traffic control clearance, but in fact we don't as pilots do that. The tug driver does it himself, and we monitor that on our radio. The idea of the flight was to check all the normal systems out, and also some of the standby systems, just so we can make sure that everything was fit for normal flight when it does go to New York carrying passengers for the first time.
Having traversed what must be the most unusual crossroads in the world, the youngest of the Concorde fleet, known as Alpha Golf, taxis out for her first flight in 15 months.
We get towed across until they bring the aircraft to a halt. They tell us to park, and then we get the ground supplies, start all 4 engines, of course, and then we taxi away from there doing our taxi trials, which involves the normal systems for brakes and steering and the standby systems.
The success of this flight would determine the immediate future, with the crews eagerly awaiting the green light to be given for commercial services to resume to New York a couple of weeks later.
We share the flying out the best we can. Although I had to be the commander of the flight as a test pilot, I was able to give the takeoff and landing to Captain Stuart Bates, and he did that flight on Alpha Golf.
As this 3-hour test flight to halfway across the Atlantic and back takes to the air, the next major milestone across the Atlantic to New York was just around the corner. With the quartet of Olympus engines in full cry, a fanfare of car alarms heralds Concorde's return. Within days, the first of the newly modified Concordes reached JFK, heralding the start of the new era for supersonic travel.
I was the last captain to fly Concorde away from New York last year, a British Airways Concorde that was, and the first captain to fly back in, so I had to carry on the professional job with deep emotion inside as well. Absolutely elated to come on stand, and I saw the faces that saw me off last year, at that stage looking forlorn and sad, but this year happy smiling faces, lots of waving and kisses from the ladies being blown through the air. It was rather nice.
The great news is the airplane's back flying again. It's flying with new tires designed by Michelin. It's flying with armour-plated wiring for the brake fan areas around the undercarriage. The airplane basically is safer than it's ever been before, and I cannot wait for another flight on Concorde myself. I think I'll have to go and buy myself a ticket, and I'm really looking forward to seeing her flying for the next 15 years.
It would be a very interesting exercise to go and see where the future lay in terms of what people want, because it seems now increasingly unlikely that there'll be another supersonic jet passenger liner, probably within my lifetime, and certainly within the next generation. And so this opportunity is only going to exist for a few more years. So people who haven't done it had probably better get on and do it.